Thank you so much for this, Joni.
Ready? Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the Barbara and David Zalaznick reading series at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. I am Aishan Hutchinson, the new director of the Creative Writing Program, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, a reading and a conversation featuring the acclaimed poet Michael Pryor. This event is the first of 4 in our fall 2020 virtual series titled At Home. We are all currently at home, dealing with, in different ways, a new enforced solitude because of the COVID pandemic and other dissonances of our moment. The title of our series, At Home, acknowledges our ruptured social connection, but it is also a way of insisting that our displacement at home creates composite homes and sites of togetherness through readings and conversations like the one you're about to witness. Please join us for our other events in this series, details and dates of which can be found on our website, and we have included that information in the Zoom chat. Included in the Zoom chat as well are links to purchase Michael Pryor's recent book, Burning Province. The series is made possible thanks to the generosity and continual support of Barbara and David Zalaznick, to whom I'd like to extend our immense gratitude. I would like to also pay special gratitude to the former director of the Creative Writing Program, Helena Maria Vermontes. Helena's defiant writing has long given home to dispossessed voices of our country. Ringing in my ears are words Helena said in her AWP keynote address delivered in San Antonio at the beginning of lockdown last March. Helena said, "My projects are never quite chosen, but are revealed to me in ways both mysterious and foundational to my opposition of historical amnesia and erasure." Foundational to Helena's role as director of the Creative Writing Program at Cornell was a similar vigilance and compassion and love, curating a deep form of what Denise Ferreira de Silva called difference without separability, and what I would call home. Helena, I am forever a student and a fan of yours. Gracias por el todo, el trabajo que tú has hecho. One final matter before I invite my wonderful colleague, Joni Makowski, to introduce Michael Pryor and later moderate a conversation with him, is that you can ask questions throughout the program by typing them in the chat box in the upper right of your screen. A reminder that this event is being recorded. And to welcome Professor Makowski, here is a line from T.S. Eliot's The Difficulties of a Statesman. May we not be sometime, almost now, together. Joni.
Thank you, Aishan. Thank you. I'm Joni Makowski. I'm professor with the Creative Writing Program here at Cornell. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest this evening, Michael Pryor. Michael Pryor's first book of poems, Model Disciple, published by Vehicule Press in 2016, was named one of the best Books of the Year by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. His second book, Burning Province, McClelland and Stewart, Penguin Random House, came out to great anticipation this past spring. Michael Pryor's poems navigate the strange zones between self and other, head and heart, reality and art, and they enact a wholeness that does not shy from the ways that we are rent and incomplete. Michael's poems have appeared or are forthcoming in numerous magazines and anthologies across North America and the UK, including Poetry, The New Republic, Narrative Poetry Northwest, Ambit, The Margins, Poetry Island Review, Global Poetry Anthology 2015, and the Academy of American Poets Poem a Day series. He is a past winner of Magma Poetry's Editor's Prize, the Walrus Poetry Prize, and Matrix Magazine's Lit Pop Award for Poetry. Michael's an assistant professor of English at Macalester College. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Toronto and also from here, Cornell University. It's such a pleasure to have you here, Michael, this evening and to hear these wonderful poems.
Thank you so much, Joni. It's so wonderful to be introduced by you, and thank you for that lovely and generous introduction. Thank you, Aishan in the English department, for inviting me. Thank you, Lynn Lauper, who did so much to organize this, and the folks at eCornell. And thank you also to Barbara and David Zalaznick for endowing this series. I used to attend it regularly as a graduate student, and I'm really honored to be reading in it now. And thank you, everyone, for being here in the virtual audience. I'm in Minnesota right now. And where I'm reading from, I'm situated on the ancestral homeland of the Dakota people. I just wanted to acknowledge that, and that they were forcibly exiled from the land because of aggressive and persistent settler colonialism. So today, I'm going to be reading poems from my new book, Burning Province. And I wanted to provide a little background on the book and who I am. So I'm a Yonsei, a fourth generation Japanese Canadian. And to paraphrase the Sansei writer David Mira, Sansei's third generation, I've come to experience that appellation, Yonsei, as much as a series of questions as it is a label. And so many of these questions are ones that circled the peripheries of my life while I was growing up, and they have to do with the Japanese Canadian and Japanese American internments during the Second World War. So not long after Pearl Harbor, my Japanese grandparents and their families were stripped of their possessions and property and forcibly incarcerated in camps in the interior of British Columbia. And so the same thing happened to 20,000 other Japanese Canadians and 120,000 other Japanese Americans in states along the West Coast. So in Canada, Japanese Canadian possessions and properties were liquidated to pay to build and run the camps, and people weren't allowed back to the coast of British Columbia for 5 years after the war ended. So my grandparents were reticent to talk about the camps, and this reticence is, I think, very common among people of her generation. They rarely mentioned those years, and I didn't really hear about them until I was older from my mother, who told me the first kind of complete anecdotes about that time in their lives. Over time, though, they began to more openly share their memories, and these recollections became inextricable for me, for my sense of selfhood, who I am in relation to my family and where I grew up. So all this translates to in my writing, I think, is a focus on intergenerational memory and cultural trauma. Marianne Hirsch calls this post-memory, the cultural and familial processes by which one inherits and often re-witnesses memories that aren't experientially one's own. There's a quote I particularly like from Bell Hooks, Teaching to Transgress. She's paraphrasing Thomas Merton, I think. And she says, the purpose of an education is to give one the tools with which to authentically and spontaneously define oneself in relation to the world. And I feel like that's very much what I believe about poems and how they work. And so my relationship to the interment is often this kind of like, exploring it through poetry has become a kind of imaginative education, complicated by the time that separates me from that event, and the fact that my father's family, like so many white Canadians, were passive bystanders to this persecution. So in my work, I'm often trying to think through my own mixed race experience and all its ambiguities. I'm also interested in how various approaches to poetic form, including traditional verse forms, might not only evoke the physical and psychological constraints of the camp, but also might be renovated to express the tensions that have shaped my experience, suggesting that in literary and cultural contexts, subversion and homage needn't be mutually exclusive acts. So the first poem I want to read is an ekphrastic piece, and it responds to a multimedia sequence by the Japanese-Canadian visual artist Keila Isomura called the Suitcase Project. So Isomura traveled up and down the west coast of North America through British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, and California, and presented fourth and fifth generation Japanese Americans and Japanese Canadians with reproductions of the original internment orders from 1942, which mandated that adults were allowed 150 pounds of luggage and children were allowed to bring 175 pounds of luggage with them to the camps. And so, like in the original circumstance, she gave these people 24 hours or 48 hours to pack what they would bring with them and then photograph the contents of their suitcases. So Derek Walcott has spoken about a poetics that conjugates the past and present tenses simultaneously. And this is an idea that's really resonated with me, and I see it certainly at work in Isomura's sequence. So this poem is called 150 Pounds. And it starts with an epigraph from the BC Security Commission, who organized the internment in British Columbia. Each adult will be allowed 150 pounds, and each child will be allowed 75 pounds of baggage. In some, the luggage lies open like a mouth mid-sentence. In others, closed zippers grimace. What would you have brought? Slippers, a stuffed platypus, a gold watch on a chain, copper pots swaddled in bedding. The hypotheses that thinking can be things, that each decision shrinks a pained mind to the space inside a suitcase. Include lacquered chopsticks, silver forks, a hammer scarred by rust, the orders nailed to telephone poles and doors. Omit what you whispered then, most of what you've seen. I was given 48 hours notice, 24. I passed ice and pines and plains. I rode an iron serpent into the interior beside 400 others. It was humid. It was cold. If pain is remembered to be dismissed, if fear still seeds its rotting forest, this is a gardener's trowel, a blue skein of yarn, a violin, a ukulele, a ukulele, a ukulele. This is a porch light flicked on and off an abscess night. These are pear blossoms falling on the driveway like footprints in black ice. Memories, river stones metamorphic and worn. How many might an able-bodied individual carry through livestock stalls and mud, onto a bus, a train, into a tiny uninsulated shack? Most say the same. It could happen again. It is happening now. I couldn't make room for a dogless collar, a houndstooth scarf, a steel urn packed in styrofoam, a letter recording blood's divisive fractions. My father would not have come. My mother, my stepsister, my brother. What matters is not what you bring, but what you keep. She was there. He was, too. So the next poem I'm going to read is called Auction. And I grew up on an island in the river delta just south of Vancouver in British Columbia. And across the island from where I grew up, there's what used to be a Japanese fishing village. Of course, it was kind of destroyed by the war and internment. And this poem, I think, serves as sort of an incantation for home and all the people I miss. Auction. A house with a broken face facing the straight. An eviction pinned and fluttering against the door. A trawler's dry rot above the sea, and higher, a bristling wreath of gulls, their hollow marrow, their ampersand hearts. You passed from here as photograph. You passed as a current through storm-down cables, intractable signals curdling water, air. In a lifetime, this will all be bound by water, the geologist said, atop the crumbling peninsula, while looking a little too pleased. Burnt vines frayed the trail. Blackbirds hemmed thorn and shadow. Whose lifetime anyway? His? Yours? We weary improvisers, scabbing our hands in the bracken, shifting frames along the mantle. Our aim no more than the careful arrangement of dust. How carefully you would unstitch the thorns from my skin. Now, sallow headlights crawl across the kitchen glass at night, as if in search of water. The sink fills itself with sand. I wanted to be the one to tell you this, to miss you best. When the land is gone, meet me where it was. So I'm fascinated by the way certain memories seem to merge or have kind of like correspondences. And so one memory that both my grandparents often talked about from their time in the camps was the way in which the funerals were carried out, which was in the traditional kind of Japanese cremation style. So bodies were put on top of wooden pyres and the whole thing was lit aflame. And so this was an image that kind of stuck in my memory. And I didn't make the connection, but when I was a kid, my favorite movie, I think, was Star Wars Return of the Jedi. My grandmother had a VHS copy, probably because she really liked Harrison Ford. And I think I wore it out playing it so many times. And I used to try and make her and my grandfather watch it with me. And it was only recently, I guess, I realized, that at the end of the movie, when they burn Darth Vader's body and have kind of like a funeral pyre for it, that was actually kind of a Japanese cremation rite, because George Lucas has taken a lot of his visual cues and tropes for those films from Kurosawa and like other Japanese cinema. So I often wondered whether they made that connection as well, having watched it so many times with me. So this is a poem called Light and Years. I remember how she rewound the VHS each time I pleaded to see the falcon sail free from a dead star's fiery pointillism. Or how he leaned back, answered, "We waited for it to end," when I asked, "What did you do in the camp?" Years later, it's difficult to say who first described the midnight funerals, the way rows of tar paper shacks roiled in recollection like sap boiling beneath its grain, the black hole of a body unbodied by heat. Neither knew the names of the deceased. What did they feel then, watching again and again, while the sky bowed its damp forehead to the flames, wind unfurling birch bark in striated swaths of white? For a cheek's burst capillaries, glaucoma's blizzard in an eye, conjure older worlds, constellations burnt out before we see them. Still, we see them. I couldn't wait to unwrap the blistered cellophane, a foil like galaxies stippling, the rock salt that flecked the frozen asphalt of their South Vancouver home. Patience, patience, then a sidereal scroll of names and places I couldn't read flashed past their hands, darkly knotted over the couch cushions. Mine knuckled pallid during that final scene, where dead fathers, living daughters, and unborn sons wait by the fire for an obsidian mask to fill with ash, to unbecome its pain. Difficult to say, we watched it again and again. I'm also really interested in who gets to define the questions of authenticity that are central to any given ethnic community, especially Japanese American and Japanese Canadian communities, in which the majority of people of my generation are mixed race. And there's even a documentary about this called One Big Happy Family by Jeff Chibi, I think, is the filmmaker. And it kind of explores how Japanese Canadians of my mother's generation, over 90% of them are in mixed race marriages. So in this context, I'm interested in what the reservoirs of culture are. And of course, one of the largest reservoirs of culture is language. And I don't speak Japanese. My mother doesn't speak Japanese. And this is because my grandparents deliberately didn't teach her. They were very much invested in her becoming a model Canadian. And so the only Japanese I heard growing up was when they were scolding me if I was doing something naughty or something I shouldn't have been. And like many Japanese Canadians, they adopted English names after the war and used those for the rest of their lives. And so I didn't even know until fairly recently, that my grandmother had a Japanese name, and even now I struggle to pronounce it. And so this poem is for her. Both of them played a large part in my upbringing. I was very close with them. I'm very close with them. And my grandmother had a particularly interesting story. She was given away by her family to another family in the camps. And then after the war, she worked as a domestic servant for various white families to earn room and board so that she could finish high school. And so the only other things I think you need to know about this poem is that there's a phrase, "No Japs from the Rockies to the sea," which was a slogan used by some racist political parties in British Columbia before the Second World War. And there's an expression, "shikata ganai," which means in Japanese, "it can't be helped." And it's a very common sort of refrain among people of my grandparents' generation. It expresses kind of the need to not look back and to kind of put the past in the past. My pronunciation was wrong. She said, "Forget the dishes," and he hit me with a wooden spoon until I bled. Passed from one family to another in the camp. She wore tin cans like stilts, drew circles in the dirt. She wasn't my mother at first. Terrible at blackjack, Texas Hold'em. Her stepfather sent letters frantic for cash, each written in a different hand. Penticton, Kelowna, no Japs from the Rockies to the sea. Baskets of Braeburn, serene, the orchard's auburn waves of leaves and branches. School all day, worked until she slept, ironed and swept, fried kippers and eggs, put someone else's kids to bed. The smell of dried fish. Everyone fights sometimes, it's fine, they fed me every day. Her husband shouted in his sleep about sawmills, houses built from dust. She tended theirs, pruned the garden's rising swaths of summer. There was too much left unsaid. To me, shikata ganai, and leave your sister alone. She liked pickled shiso, Sir Roger Moore, and Hallmark Christmas ornaments. Disliked flying and talking about the past. Once I watched her feed sugar water to a honeybee with a spoon. Silver coins she couldn't afford slipped from her palm to mine. She said, "Don't tell your mother," and farted is an excellent word. A man lost all her money twice. Salt water, slatted blinds, sallow moon that spawns along the Fraser. Riverside apartments in diminishing square footage, Coquitlam to Richmond, Richmond to Surrey, that undistinguished block of Hastings where her stepmother's shop once stood. In front of us, she never said her given name. And so my grandmother passed away while I was beginning to write the first poems that would make up this book. And at the time, it was 2015, and British Columbia, much like I suppose California now, was full of wildfires in the interior. The sky was orange, and I remember looking out of the windows of the palliative care ward on the 16th floor of Vancouver General. I was with her, and I just seen like this like very reddish orange sky and these clouds of smoke rolling out towards the sea. So this is an elegy for her. It takes its title from a poem by James Merrill. Some of you may have picked up on that when you see it. And I think the only other thing I want to note is that something that I was very interested in while writing the book was thinking about kind of the different craft metaphors which can guide or generate poems. And one I stole from Lisa Russ Spar, who's a very fantastic poet, is thinking about the way in which a poem moves and what it means for a poem to fold things. We often think of line breaks as a kind of break or demarcation, right? But I've been really interested in thinking about how poems might fold, how syntax might be a kind of folding in a sentence, how the line break is a folding of the poem as a whole, and how might we fold images and phrases and ideas into each other over the course of a collection. So this poem is called In Cloud Country. In cloud country, water has but two states. We feel the crease between a wave and its cold, between us and the sun. In cloud country, your mind settles its mist across the TV's broken screen, the ivy's taped labels, the metal rungs strung along the bed frame like ladders into a hidden room. Here, Kyushu is a doorway left ajar, a nightlight shadow shift. Here, we admit ourselves to paper's ninth and impossible fold. The way we say hello, meaning hold on a little longer, or I don't know, meaning it's true. Errant cells spill like sea salt over the corridor's mirrored linoleum as we shuffle from floor to floor, and you live long enough to see your glasses return to style, your plaid shirts, your knit cardigans. Within our borders, your hair frays cirrus into sky, while that bride, so serious in every photo, never had to be you. Drowsy, draining through a plastic tube, in cloud country you say, that was all so long ago. Each closet a mossy gate, each wormwood cabinet a cabin dissolving in your nowhere backwoods, with a pluralist story, the singular skin, and the notice stapled to the door does not make of one face many. Was there ever a quiet street, a pink bungalow, a trio of hunched maples, a cup of cooling sencha waiting in this nation for you? In cloud country you say it feels like I'm being eaten and choke down spoonfuls of ice cream, lemon jello. We thicken your water with powdered bone. In cloud country, the horizon doesn't sever the sky, but spills upwards, a helix of white smoke, burnt leaves, while the fledglings in our chest bear no desire to leave the nest or rot to barbed wire. At this latitude, the textbooks declare the heart an uncracked robin's egg, the mind a clever mockingbird's, and every morning is the morning you showed us the bitterns, curtained by bulrushes, towering in their sleep. You closed our eyes as we passed the one broken on the boulevard. It is here that you promised to reveal how to uncrimp each beak from its paper bud, how to unfurl each wing with the perfect pressure of fingers not yet talons, veins not yet tunnels of wind and sleet. It is here that you mutter, I had a name, so that we understand. Every animal has wings. No dignity and indignity, you kept it all to yourself in cloud country, where the sheets folded you and the crinkled gown exposed you, where the swallows never stood still and never stood for want. We kept them to ourselves. We kept this for you. You plead, leave a window open, a skylight unlocked. We flattened our faces against the glass's double pane. We couldn't finish those final folds alone. You left us for an image of astounding order. There was no order. We listened to the radio for your whereabouts until we too bear throats racked by static, blistered with Coriolis. The fields that stretch behind the boulevard rise and evaporate easy from their bedrock, now no different than bed. In cloud country, it rains newspaper cranes. It cries Fuji to scale. It hears your tectonic mumble merge with ours. There is no scale for now and then. You are the paper's 103rd fold, the nebula's gauzed edge. In cloud country, you say, thank you. We say, thank you. So the next poem requires a little context, I think. I grew up in a town where there was this park that was built atop of what used to be a horse racing track. And the park was named Minoru after this celebrity racehorse that won a lot of derbies and stuff back in the late 19th, early 20th century. So famous that like the horse was even painted in Vanity Fair. I think that's the image you're looking at now. But anytime I drove by this like former racetrack with my mother, she would always pronounce the name Minoru, de-emphasizing the first syllable, as all the syllables had equal kind of weight, as if the word were Japanese. And so it used to really bother me that she did that. And as a kid, I would always say, Mom, it's not Japanese. Stop trying to make it Japanese. And there's a statue of the horse at the track as well. Well, I did a lot of research, and it turns out the horse's name was initially Japanese. The owner of the horse was a Scottish lord who had employed a Japanese gardener. And the lord was so pleased with the gardener's work that he named his racehorse after the gardener's mixed race son, Minoru. And so this, park and racetrack is actually where my parents were married. So ultimately, I guess this is a poem about how my mother is always right, which is, she's listening, I think, so she'll be happy to hear that. Minoru. The horse in my mind is not the horse in the park. His canter bronzed beneath maples and a plaque blazoned Minoru. Minoru, says my mother, de-emphasizing the expected syllable as if the word were Japanese. Home for winter, pines and cedars merge in the car's convergence of distance and speed. They bow to each other's shadows. I want to run further than I can see. Minoru churning clods of earth as he rounds the track at Doncaster. Minoru, thoroughbred, bred to step lightly, lightly stepping through snow's patina along the steps, where he rests, time cindering his name. But before the horse, the master gardener from Kyushu, whose green thumbs grew sore with expatriation, razoring lawns across the cold hills of Kildare, twisting hedgerows into mazes, pruning moss as soft as a stallion's foam-flecked mane. For his talent, a horse, to share his youngest son's name. Minoru. Of course it's Japanese. Of them, who was furthest from home? Father, mother, mixed-race son? The park and the track flicker into frame, our breath fogging the windshield's washed-out glass, faces folding time. That portrait in which the gardener holds his eldest like a dove, while Minoru sits alone on his mother's lap. Why the long face, my mother asks. She drives the speed limit, comes to a complete stop before every line. We pass the track, the statue, mane-ribbed mid-sway, as if subject to the same wind shivering the branches. Minoru, victorious, mimetic in oils for Vanity Fair, painted by Earl, by Havel, his glossy wake, a wave rippling top hats and swallowtail coats, dark as storm-bruised water. Minoru thundering into the final heat at Epsom. Minoru snorting under King George's gouty hand. Minoru of the Triple Crown, the Irish Downs, swallowed up by a crowd of supporters pulling hairs from his mane and tail. For hair's curlicue on canvas, feel the pressure of the brush. Crop to stirrup, bridle to spur. Once I watched my mother mourn her mother. She used a name I can't pronounce. Ise, Nise, Okasan. Liquid lilt of a seashell's hum, voices hushed behind closed doors. Though raised mostly in English, in college she was forced into a beginner's class. She waited. She passed. When we pass the statue, she laughs. Mom, how could the name be Japanese? Statue, park, and ruddy track remade from recycled tires, where for years in elementary, I ran the 100-meter dash while she applauded from the stands. Only, ever silver, never quick enough. As a girl, she rode the neighbor's worn-out hot blood after school. No saddle, just a wool blanket folded in half. He would gallop the same counterclockwise loop along his paddock's muddy acre, habit's burnished track. She gripped his mane and never fell. You know, I can't remember what he was called. Their lives dissolve in mediums as amnesiac as water. Minoru's father returned to his island to die. The horse, foundered and nearly blind, was sold across the ocean into a revolution's measure, a motion spent like crests collapsing against the coast. In the kanji that she can barely read, one shoulder is turned as if to recall receding miles. Uma, meaning horse, I'm sorry, ma. Her maiden name, a copse of trees. They shiver when I turn the page. From 10,000 feet, the ochre track is a serpent circling the unknown at the edges of a Renaissance map. I wave, and again I am alone. The windows scratched acrylic, a dead stallion's eye. Each sentence I try is built from words like the wood in Theseus's ship. The boy, now lost to a century's blue-black ebb like snow into the sea. Don't be such a precious snowflake. my mother says. The stallion, one win short of the Triple Crown. My intonation, one stress too many for an apology, all the times I got it wrong. Minoru, both are gone. Their twinned weight sinking back through the past, like the rings passed hand to hand in the chapel beside the park, the track, the statue, where years ago my mother said the word and took my father's name. This next poem, I don't think I'm going to say anything about it except that it incorporates a text from my father, which is an actual text from my father I got, and that people always ask me if the title is true, and I get to say yes. My father's birthday is the day before mine. The last train pulses across the pane, and fireflies spark beside the tracks. Acne's red wing flames my face. I can't take back this skin. In the other room, a drugstore Timex synchronizes with the faucet's drip. If I squint, the fireflies align their lives to map the summer's migraine of flowers that were weeds. You say, but I think they're just trying to survive. Cheap bulbs, they burn out in 2 weeks. The train rattles as its links shift and scrape like the dark between days. From across the continent, my father texts. Your mother hiked halfway up the hill behind the cabin, a graceful mountain goat. Is this love? Lately, I've been writing you letters as I shred about that blood orange eclipse, sleep's determined murmurs of eyelid and lash. The fireflies are sunset's ash. I realize I have no means by which to make you a present of the past, where my father once cowered behind the June sunflowers, bloodied by the dog chain his father had swung, not at his son, but at the fear of being left without one. The fireflies stutter like an apology. I would be lying to you if I didn't admit I love them. So I'm going to read just 2 more poems. This first poem, I think, is, or the second last poem, I should say, is thinking a lot about the difference between textual experience and lived experience. It takes its title from a poem by James Schuyler. I'm always looking for mentions of Canada in American poetry, and there are so few, and this is one of them. The light from Canada falls over the brushed steel of Ontario and Erie, rises where the flows fracture and dissolve. Is it true that the first things we read and feel never leave our vocative? A darkling thrush, a darkling plain, the eyes search for the mind's glinting level. To say the light falls, or it's from, is misdirection. It has no discernible mass, belongs to no one. I worry about you, said my grandfather, for whom my feelings remained irrevocable. I had thought myself worried for him too. It was late. We ate blackberries from an earthenware bowl, drank instant coffee, and stood by a bonfire in the rain because it was New Year's and he had no home he could return to. Where I grew up, vines barbed the highway, bridged the ditches, as if desperate to prove themselves necessary to a whole. There is a hole at the center of every knotted mass, a nebula of mold. Some nights, I worry I've studied the field guides more than the fields. Here is blackberry, skullweed, eelgrass, there the canker rose. Names that rise into place like the lenses that fell between my eyes and a wall of wordless letters. Well, someone unseen repeated, is this clearer or this? I feel like every poet has a poem about blackberries. So this is the last poem I'm going to read. Its epigraph comes from the medieval Japanese monk Kenko, who wrote a series of zuitsu, which is kind of a fragmented personal essay that moves associatively, called Essays in Idleness. It's a poem about memory and family. It's also a kind of love poem, but it's the only sort of like love poem I feel able to write. which is one that starts with brain-eating insects. So this is Wakeful Things. And the epigraph from Kenko reads, "You should never put the new antlers of a deer to your nose and smell them. They have little insects that crawl into the nose and devour the brain. Consider that the insects might be metaphor, that the antler's wet velvet scent might be Proust's Madeleine dipped into a cup of tea, adorned with centrifugal patterns of azalea and willow. Those flushing the hill behind this room, walls wreathed in smoke and iron, musk of the deer head above the mantel. He was nailed in place before I was me. Through the floorboards, a caterpillar, stripped from its chrysalis by red ants, wakes, as if to a house of flame. Silk phrase, like silver horns, like thoughts branching from a brain. After the MRI, my father's chosen father squinted at the wormholes raveling the screen and said, 'Be good to one another.' Love, how inelegantly we leave, how insistent we are to return in one form or another. I wish all of this and none of it for us. More sun, more tempest, more fear and fearlessness, more of that which is tempered, carved, and worn, creased into overlapping planes. The way I feel the world's aperture enlarge in each morning's patchwork blur of light and color, while I fumble for my glasses beside the bed. Lenses smudged by both our hands. When they were alive, those antlers held up the sky. Now, what do they hold? Thank you."
Wow. Wow. It's so beautiful. Thank you, Michael. Let's see. Michael, let's see what's happening. The host has asked you to start my video. Okay, thank you. Let's see.
Hi, Joni.
Hello, Michael. That was just so gorgeous. Thank you so much. And so, yeah, let's talk about these wonderful poems, this wonderful book. Here's a question, a way to begin, perhaps. The book is, well, it's complicated. This is not linear, and it's about generational trauma, I think environmental trauma, but which are not linear processes, or recursive processes. And but the book also describes, I think, kind of an opening, ways of opening to the past, opening to other creatures. I think it's a book of multiple exposures. How did you start writing it? Did you start connecting the themes? Where did it start and how did it go?
Oh, wow. Thanks. That's a great question, Joni. Multiple exposures. I really like that. I think if there's one event, of course, that kind of initiated it was my grandmother's death, which was very close to her, and it was very unexpected in many ways. And I described, I think, in the reading, the particular kind of visual scape that I was noticing when she passed away. She was very close to the end, and there was all this we're reading about all these fires. The hospital smoke alarms are going off. The sky was orange. There was smoke rolling out to the sea, and it felt very much like the world was mourning her, which of course is like what Ruskin would call the pathetic fallacy. But it did, there's a way in which experientially it's not a fallacy, and so that was sort of the opening for the book. Because from that I drew the particular sensory palette, I think, and metaphorical palette the book works through. I always tell my students, one of the most important parts of putting together a collection, at least for me, is thinking about how you create that grammar of images and description and metaphor, and how that, if you can invest deeply enough in that grammar, you can figure out the metaphors that are going to then be generative craft-wise in how you approach the poems. So that's kind of where it came from for me, that particular palette, sensory palette from when my grandmother was passing. And of course, I guess the poem's also interested in all kinds of topographies of memory, of that physical landscape, of what it means to like be somewhere where something was, as in the case of the internment camps, and not be able to see much visual trace of that, but know that there's like, so many people whose like communal imagination is centered around this particular specific location. So I think that's kind of where it came from. I don't know if that's a real specific answer to your question, but.
No, it's great. And here, how about a question about poetry? As I'm thinking about the ways that you are drawing out is your your palette, and poetry's. How did you get interested in poetry? It's kind of a weird habit, And what is your practice like? You say metaphorical palette drawing out. You make it sound very material. But how do you, when working with something as immaterial as text, how do you affect that, transubstantiation? How do you make it matter?
Oh, wow, that's wonderful. I think I came to poetry. It is weird, isn't it? We're all weirdos writing our poems. But I think I came to it because it was a form, you said it's like a recursive book, a cyclical kind of book. It's not linear. I think that's what attracted me about poetry in poetic form, which often depends on reiterations and repetitions of various sorts, right? Especially like inherited verse forms. And that to me felt much more inherent in my way of thinking than something like, the kinds of structures we associate with like more conventional prose, I guess, or like prose fiction. And so I came to poetry late, I think, in my life. For a lot of people, anyhow. I didn't start writing until I was pretty much done my undergraduate. So yeah, that's why I came to it. It felt like it was a form that best suited these questions about selfhood that I was interested in. Emily Chongmin Yoon says that poetry is a way to theorize the self. And, I think I agree a lot of the time. So that's why I came to it. As for like the transubstantiation or the materiality of the text, I try and make my poems as full of things as possible, as full of reference as possible. I'm really interested in how our attention to like objects, like in the poem 150 Pounds, right, becomes a way of thinking, right? I think we see this in Bishop, where seeing becomes a way of thinking, right? So that's one way I'm interested in it. Poems, are often about figuring out the right collocations of detail and description, and then seeing what the resonances are between them. At least that's like often how it works for me. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the other materiality I think about is like how the poem lives in the body, right? Mm-hmm. And for me, I really care a lot about sound. So much so that I obsess over it to the point where sometimes I lose sense, I think. But I really love, there's a ghost of meter in a few of these poems. There's a lot of dependence, again, on reiteration and cycling back in different ways sonically as well as through imagery. So yeah, I'm just very invested in those things, I think, as a poet.
Wonderful. Speaking about sound, then, the poem Campanology, mm-hmm. About the clock tower, it includes the line, the bells speak only in and through collision. And I wonder, are you just talking about those bells, or are there other things? Do other things in your life speak through collision?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, first of all, going back to sound briefly, I just wanted to say like how I remember one time we sat down for coffee and you walked me through one of my own sonnets and showed me how all the sound was working in greater detail and with such intricacy and on the meter, and it was literally mind-blowing, and it was a very big moment for me as a writer. But in terms of like that line from Campanology, I think metaphor is that kind of collision often, right? And so that's something I think about, right? Because metaphor can be a thing where we're like the sensory accuracy of the vehicle and the tenor, or their like correlation is clear. But it can also be a way of putting together things that kind of are jarring, and there's an interesting kind of clang when you do that. And in my own experience, being mixed race often feels, especially when I was younger, often felt like that, because you inhabit this strange kind of uncanny valley in regards to your appearance, and it often felt like a kind of like collision of things.
Wow, great. Denise Levertov called metaphor visual rhyme. Mm-hmm. So just what you said, it's lovely. that there's a question from Shristi. Am I saying her name right? Your former student, Shristi in Massachusetts.
Shriya Parati, I think. Maybe. Yeah.
Shristi.
Oh, yeah, Shristi, yeah.
Oh, good. And she said 4 years ago, and she says elated to be here. And her question, a lovely question, has your style of writing poetry evolved over the years? If so, how?
I mean, I hope so. I think so. I mean, when I look back on my first book, I think there was much more investment in a series of kinds of masks as a way of exploring things. And I think now I feel a little more emboldened to apply more kind of direct approaches. I think I'm also, I mean, it has to have changed because I'm reading very different people and like trying to have conversations with those writers more so. I'd be hard pressed to say exactly how it has changed, but I mean, doing the MFA was certainly an eye-opening and transformative experience, getting to work with you, getting to work with Aishin, Alice, Lyrae, people who showed me possibilities in poetry that I hadn't been aware of, or articulated things that I had felt but hadn't been able to articulate. So it's sort of a non-answer, but I mean, I hope so.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yes. It's here's another question I have. In terms of the topics in the book, the subjects. One thing you didn't speak about directly this evening is all the animals in these poems, all the creatures, and I'm reading them as sort of takes on self and other again, and the strangeness inherent in being, and what pulls you into what has pulled you into these poems about creatures?
I mean, I think you've articulated it wonderfully. I think that's entirely it. It's the idea of self and other, because they're not poems that are attempting to somehow linguistically, be accurate about that creature's non-human experience, right? Which is sometimes what I feel nature poetry attempts to do or dabbles to in the human medium of language. But they're not that. They're certainly thinking about self and other and using, I guess, attention again as a way to discover attention to an external object or thing as a way to discover something about the self, right? Mm-hmm. Tom Gunn has said, many other people have said that poetry, the act of writing a poem is an act of discovery, act of exploration. And I feel like if you're able to focalize your attention and like that act around a particular thing, you can often get somewhere very interesting and somewhere deeper than if you were like very, very broad or expansive attention towards everything.
Oh, lovely, lovely. I would love to hear the poem Salamander.
Oh, yes, of course, yeah. I don't have it on my PDF on screen, so I'm just...
Can I...
I know, I've got it right here in my book.
You do? Okay, good.
Yeah. Salamander. Rain boils the river. It sloughs its silver into the canals that cut the city blocks. Tonight, her hands emerge from behind amber glass intact, then submerge and shatter. On my way here, couples bloomed in unison along the commons. They huddled under umbrellas, slick and glistening, dark as a Victorian garden. I'm listening to her voice falling in my ear, the roof's faint patter when she texted, "If it wasn't so late, we could look for salamanders." My mind circles, stirs its bowl of smoke. Later, she will admit she wants her, and I'll admit the syllogism's shadow creature. The candle on our table twitches, twists, lets slip its flame. Her fingers cup its specter, muscles gripped amphibian in skin. What I'm trying to say may not be what I mean. The lack of light swells, scatters, exhaust crawls toward our chins. I know where they live, where the puddles flood and merge, where the road bisects the woodland, where we'll soon part for our homes. The search bar's scroll of strangers and estranged, frame and picture. I saw one of a limb lost and regrown without pain. I saw another of a species starred with fire. They sleep in the Niagara Basin and breathe through their skin. It doesn't matter that they are born without ears. They still hear the falling water.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's like one of the things I love about the book is how it teaches me to read it as I move through it, in that there are these, say, disparate experiences that as by the time I've gotten to the salamanders, the echoes of displacement in there, of technological layered on top of natural, and there are multiple places happening in that. There's multiple nows in that poem, and it. So it's exhilarating. Here's a question from okie doke. Here is a question from Connor. A great question. How do you determine how accessible you want a poem to be? How much work do you want a reader to do? Yeah, I'm thinking of a piece like Minoru, which needs knowledge of geography, language, etc., for full context.
That's a great question. I mean, when I'm drafting, I'm not concerned with audience at all. I'm writing for myself for the pleasure of language, to follow language in interesting ways, and to converse with like the dead. But, I think it depends. I said earlier that I think sometimes my obsession with sound and like the rhythms of the thing and stuff lead me places where sometimes like narrative sense is harder to map onto the poem. And I'm okay with that. I mean, Ilya Kaminsky has said somewhere about that, the job of the lyric poet is to wake up the language in new ways, new unexpected ways that are idiosyncratic to that particular poet. And I feel like that in itself is always going to, sometimes result in moments that are not that don't conform to the kind of teleologies of narrative or like situational context that we often want from a poem. So, I mean, it depends on the poem. When I was thinking about arranging the pieces in this book, I was thinking about exactly what you said, how the book can teach a reader to read it and then continually try to complicate that experience. So I feel like the earlier poems in the book, for the most part, probably require a little less context. And like you said, when you reach a certain point, you've learned how to like navigate the images in a certain way, or you hear and see the echoes. So I don't know. I mean, it's a tough thing to balance. I share work with friends a lot, and they have great comments. And if everyone's like, I have no idea what this is about, then sometimes I go back and do things. But there are moments where I'm also like, that's okay. I don't even know what it's about. Because sometimes the poem is smarter and knows more than you do.
Wow. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think I think it's time to, where's a picture of the book? Let's plug the book. And where do you click to get the book? I mean, so it's there it is. Okay. Burning Province. And it's available here in Ithaca at Buffalo Street Books. It's available by clicking. And it was such a delight. Thank you so much for this wonderful reading and letting us learn from poems, your poems.
Thank you so much, Joni, for all your time. It's been really wonderful.
So, cheers. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Oh, and right, let's see. Okay, pardon me. I am one shot. Okay, so this is. So thank you to the Zalaznicks so much for this series, and as we navigate into this new weird Zoom terrain, thank you, Cornell, for helping us navigate this terrain, and everyone, thank you for coming. Although I can't see you, I hope you've had a good time. I know you. Well, if you've had your ears open, I know you have. So the next Zalaznick reading event is a craft talk by Evelina Galang on Thursday, October 15th at 7 p.m. Hope to see you there. Bye, everyone.